Oh, we didn't talk about the virgin proletariat at all, but
The virgin proletariat, yeah. I see some virgin proletariats out there. When I talk to other communists, goddamn.
hello!
Yo, what up?
Welcome to Left Unread. My name is Aaron.
I'm Will.
This is a podcast where two dudes engage in a radical self-education.
That's right. We're simply two mechanized crystallizations of libidinal energy, baby. This week we read...
The Transitional Program by...
The Death Agony of Capitalism and the Tasks of the Fourth International.
Yes, by Leon Trotsky.
Yes. This is part of our Trotsky check-in, I feel. You know, we're still determining whether Trotskyites are cultists or not. I'm leaning towards they are, unfortunately. But it's worth checking in on Trotsky. He was obviously a theoretical writer. This piece, to my surprise, when we picked it, I didn't realize it was written in 1938. So actually an in-exile piece. And upon reading, it makes much more sense that it is that way. But just to bring you up to speed on where Trotsky was in 1938... By 1938, Trotsky had already been exiled, sentenced to death in absentia, and kicked out of Norway. He was welcomed by Mexico's nationalist president. Nationalist in the cool way, not in the
In the cool
Yeah,
way.
in the cool way, because he was the nationalism of the oppressed. Anyway, and he was living and having an affair with Frida Kahlo in the house with her husband as well, Diego Rivera. And also his wife was there. I don't know if that was clear. Anyway, Trotsky spent his days founding his alternative to the Comintern, the Fourth International, which, by the way, has a banger logo. Having already completed his seminal analysis on the corruption and degeneration of the Soviet workers' state, the revolution betrayed, Trotsky then set the stage for worldwide opposition to Stalin's reign of terror. So yeah.
This is an interesting piece in the timeline because it's really interesting to see a non-Stalinist at the brink of World War II.
Yeah.
And the way that they're interpreting and analyzing the kind of global events that are happening around them. Mm-hmm. In the same way that reading One Dimensional Man, it was really difficult to exercise it from the context in which it was written.
Yeah.
The like kind of atomic fear that permeated everything, every part of that text. I feel the same thing here. There's this like clear feeling in Trotsky's work here that they're on the precipice of something. It's about to snap.
Yeah. Not only that, but thinking about the context it was written in, the thing that weighed heavy on my mind was just thinking, like, how much is Trotsky's writing just like a personal beef, you know? How salty is Trotsky? That's really the thing that I was thinking this whole time. Because he does make some interesting arguments here, but they're all in contrast to the Soviet system, and I feel like he might be more willing to be critical of their actions because of who's at the helm.
I'm glad that you brought that up, because I had a very similar feeling. I think this is... Perhaps you'd mentioned already that you were starting to lean toward Trotskyist being a little bit more on the cultish side. And this work definitely nudged me in that direction as well, in large part because it is quite evident that he's fucking salty as shit, and that is obviously impacting his analysis.
Right.
And you'd sent me yesterday the thing from Walter Rodney, and it just felt so appropriate because as I was going through this, I found myself talking back to the text quite a lot, like, oh, yeah, really?
Exactly the same, yeah.
And once you call into question the kind of what Rodney called the historian side of Trotsky, his analysis of the historical events that are happening around there, once you call that into question, I think it makes it a lot harder to take with any grain of real credibility or veracity his analysis that's happening as well. And so it really has done a number on my interpretation of Trotsky up until this point. Even if I think there is valuable stuff in his theory in this text and in the stuff that we've read previously, it kind of casts a shadow over the whole thing.
Right. To what extent is Trotsky simply supporting what they oppose and opposing what they support? You know, in this case, he's talking about Stalin.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just, it's something that we'll have to see as we go further in, because I absolutely agree with you. There is interesting stuff in both the Permanent Revolution and in this piece, the Transitional Program, the Death Agony of Capitalism. But I think he's just a rizz-less loser, is my ultimate analysis. I think that he's whiny.
Yeah, he definitely comes off as beleaguered, I guess.
There you go.
Best hair in communism, least rizz.
Right, yes. Well, you know, listen, he rizzed up Frida Kahlo in front of her husband.
And then she became an ardent Stalinist.
That's true, yes. Well, it's funny because he had to move because they had a spat. He had a spat with Diego Rivera about Frida Kahlo, obviously. Yeah. So this is a pretty short piece. It was, 40, 50 pages?
Something like that.
Yeah. So, I don't know. I think we should just tackle it chronologically. What do you think?
That's fine. I found the first 15 pages or so to be pretty milquetoast.
Yeah. It did pick up towards the end.
I didn't start to get interested until he started talking about expropriation.
Well, I think, what might be interesting to talk about first is what Trotsky's actually putting forth here in terms of what the transitional program actually is.
Yeah.
Because we've joked a lot about the ideal being in between the minimum and the maximum programs, right? And in this piece, in the first 20 pages, which he found to be very boring, he talks about specifically those things, how we can transition from a minimal program being simply the reformist demands of the working class to the maximum program, right? He's saying, what's the intermediary step?
Yeah.
And the problem that it's not a problem, but the thing I really would have liked is to see how this stacked up to actual socialist development, whether that's in Russia or in China, Vietnam, any of those places, what kind of program was put into place there. That's the kind of thing I need to compare and contrast to this, because Trotsky puts forth some interesting ideas here, but I don't know how valuable they actually are because they're just theoretical, right? They're not, they're barely stacked up to the practice, with the exception of some core pillars like the Soviet itself.
Yeah, I think as I was getting started with the text and starting to understand what he was defining as a transitional program or transitional demands, whatever you want to say, I was really skeptical about it because my interpretation of actually existing socialism and just really any political movements in general is that you make a demand, however that demand is met or made, militarily or just, peacefully, whatever you want to say. A demand is made, and then some form of compromise is reached. That demand is very rarely met 100% wholesale.
Yeah.
And so my skepticism with the transitional program in general is that if your demand is already some form of compromise, then you're only going to get an even more compromised version of your intention. I realize that that's maybe a misappropriation of what he means with transitional program. As I got deeper into the text, I started to see a little bit more what point I think he was trying to drive at, which is that we can leverage that sort of movement forward to continue to activate the working class and create coalition that will help us move forward.
Right.
And so, I started to become more open to what he was presenting, but I had initial skepticism.
Yeah, it's unclear when this transitional program is being put into place, right? There's two things I'm trying to get at here. One of the main critiques of the transitional program that I've seen online, is that it's reformist, right? It's mainly a reformist thing. Yeah, and there is something to be said about the demand for a maximalist position, shoot for the stars and then make a big crater when you fall, right? But, I think that when Trotsky's referring to the transition program here, he's envisioning it in a position where the masses have seized the apparatus of bourgeois democracy, right? And now the question is, how do we build socialism once we have, the revolution happens. Trotsky's clear that it's not a single stroke, but he says even a series of convulsions, which, oh my God. And it's like the program is there to direct that kind of spastic movement, I'm sorry to use such ableist language here, into something that constructs socialism, right? And so through that lens, I think it's much clearer because he's talking about steps that we can take once we already have the power. And he mentions creating dual power here between the apparatus of the bourgeois democracy and the control of the workers and the farmers. That's probably the big distinction here, is that he's advocating for a more direct control by the workers. And he's also saying, which we'll get into, I'm sure, that there's different strata that need to be all energized, right? All activated revolutionarily to create workers' control. Just to say that I think that we do have a blind spot here because the structure ultimately of the Soviet system is something that's pretty unknown to us. I've seen I haven't really looked into it, but I've seen some history that says that the Soviets themselves, like the councils, were pretty quickly pushed to the wayside, And even as we talked in the Parenti episode, where Lenin's like, a time for the workers' opposition has come to an end, he's consolidating the party. Trotsky is still talking about advocating for democratic centralism in his transitional program here, but there is a part where he says that the workers should have essentially free association of parties, right? Which is counter to the idea of a one-party system.
Yeah, the bit about Soviets was really interesting to me. and put a lot of thoughts in my brain about what a socialist revolution, a proletarian revolution might look like in the United States.
Yeah.
And honestly, I think something like a Soviet system, like of literal Soviets, you know what I mean, makes the most sense to me.
Sure.
I don't know. Should we just jump in? I don't know. What to do.
I think we're getting, I think we're getting at different parts, but I think that that's really the core thing that I was thinking about here is like, how would this program apply? We have talked a lot about revolution and like what the revolution would look like, but the actual nuts and bolts have still been pretty absent, and that's for a lot of reasons. The fact that there's hardly even revolutionary theory about what is to be done. Sorry for the pun, and there definitely hasn't been any practice that parallels what we're going through in our modern era,
Yes, we're not an agrarian nation in the way that others would have been that saw a socialist revolution take place. And so, like, there's already from the get a very different kind of take. And it's going to look different every single place that it happens because it is a response to the context. It is a response to the environment. And it has never happened here. And so there's always going to be some form of like questions about what it's going to look like.
Yeah, we've been dealing with pre-modern theory. And, that's all geared towards revolutionizing industrialized societies. We are post-industrial. We are de-industrialized.
Yeah.
Even the structure of like organizing the work floor of a factory is different here. So, yeah, the transitional program doesn't necessarily apply to us, but it does give us some interesting things to think about when it comes to revolution in the modern era. Especially a lot of what we've dealt with so far has been how do you spark the initial revolution. Trotsky here is looking at the next step. Just to say, we are reading from The Classics of Marxism, Volume 1. This is from well-read books. They're Trots. So, hence the inclusion of the transitional program alongside the manifesto, Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific in the State and Revolution. One thing that Trotsky rallies against is the Popular Front. That's pretty clear. That's something that I think there is historical debate over. I've heard a lot of anti-popular frontism things, but I think a lot of it is because people are looking at history and seeing that these revolutions were stymied or failed. That's pretty in line with what Trotsky is saying here. So, I think that might be easy to agree with him on. We talked about that a lot during the Permanent Revolution, too. One thing I'll say here is that Trotsky really does play the hits. He says the same exact thing. I mean, I felt like I was reading the same book.
Yeah, I mean, to his credit, he is pretty steadfast in his theoretical analysis, and not that he's not being responsive. I don't think that it comes from like a hard-headedness or anything like that. I think that he has principles in the way that he sees these things happening, and he sticks to them.
Yeah,
which is good.
Sure.
Just to call out a quote on 185.
Okay.
Because talking about that, under the proletariat and its leadership, he says the chief obstacle in the path of transforming the pre-revolutionary into a revolutionary state is the opportunist character of proletarian leadership. And so this is where he does start calling out things like the Popular Front, and he calls out kind of Stalinists and anarchists at every turn as well.
Yeah, very anti-Stalin.
That's quite evident.
Yes. He says, between the minimum and the maximum program, no bridge existed. Social democracy has no need of such a bridge. The socialism is only used for holiday speechifying.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, at this point, I don't think anyone could make the argument for a social democracy that existed in like actual governments as being a force of socialism, especially in Germany. Oh my God.
Yeah.
He advocates for a sliding scale of wages and a sliding scale of hours. I thought that was kind of interesting, really a nuts and bolts policy piece, but he's saying that, the fluctuation of demand and supply has to be met with a sliding scale, because he says, this is on page 188, two basic economic afflictions in which is summarized the increasing absurdity of the capitalist system, that is, unemployment and high prices. They demand generalized slogans and methods of struggle. So he advocates a sliding scale of wages, collective agreements that assure automatic rise in wages in relation to increase in price, the right to employment, a sliding scale of working hours. So interesting ideas, I guess.
Yeah. And Trotsky loves a slogan. He hasn't started it yet, but he's going to start sloganeering as he gets deeper into the text.
Yeah, this is something that I kind of had a problem with the last Trotsky you read, but I think that I understand where he's coming from, because if we're talking about a program that's reaching a mass of people, it will require slogans. As much as I'd love to sit down and have a fireside chat with every single working class person and like politically activate them. It's just not going to happen that way. One thing that Trotsky even says here is that it's completely reasonable to use like democratic slogans, because he's talking about collaboration, right? He's talking about coalition building. That's the word I was looking for. And what he says is interesting to me because he says that the two can be intertwined, right? Socialist slogans and democratic slogans, because once the massive base of consciousness has arisen, the socialist slogans will clearly take the lead.
I think there is utility to a slogan. I think a slogan, as much as people might argue against it because it can be weaponized against a movement, I think the same thing is true, that it can be used to activate a movement or unify a movement, like Fight for 15 or something like that. It's like a very basic thing, but it becomes a pillar of a conversation that makes it much easier to understand which side of an issue you stand upon.
Yeah. What I was just thinking of is like it can fit on a poster, you can wheat paste it on a wall, right? It's the kind of thing that you don't have to depend on someone reading through. It's something that can be understood at least at face value or with a couple of sentences.
And I think that there are things that becomes very useful in the mobilization of the working class and starting to develop class consciousness. As someone that was politically active during the Occupy movement, for example, like the phrase 1% became a part of the cultural zeitgeist because of that movement and what was happening. And, you could make arguments about the efficacy of it as a movement, but what it did is it created a kind of language that normal, everyday people that aren't actively engaged in the whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. I mean, I remember Obama talking about the groundswell, like it was clearly a more massive movement than they were prepared for.
Yeah.
And then look what happened, It's because they didn't have any organization. I don't actually know that for a fact. Sorry, Aaron, if you were there. There on the square. Something I will say, man, there's a lot of times in here where he's just like, y'all are doing it wrong, but guess who's doing it right? The Fourth International. That's right, ladies and gents. There's one clear path out, and it's my path. I don't know the extent of the works of the Fourth International.
Nor I.
The thing that I kept talking back to the text about here was like, what have you done? You're talking about this organization against fascism. Guess who organized against fascism? The people that beat it, right? The people that marched an army through Europe and took Berlin.
Yeah, he hasn't really hit that yet, but there are points here where he's like talking shit on Stalin and to some degree, I would argue, conflating it with the fascist movements, specifically Mussolini.
Absolutely.
And it's like, bitch.
There's a point where he says that the state, it's like in one breath, he says the state apparatus of Stalin is fascistic, and also we must respect the difference between the workers' state and the bourgeois democracies and fascism. It's like, something that made me really laugh. It's so fucking funny to me, dude. He's like, we rally against the international and the Amsterdam International and the trade union struggle and da 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 da. And then it's like against sectarianism. I was like, what are you talking about, guy? There's no other sect for you to argue with because you just denounced them all as fucking fascists. So. Yeah,
again, that's where a lot of the loss of credibility in my interpretation of his analysis comes from, because like he starts drawing these dividing lines, like you said. He says that Stalin is politically fascist, but economically socialist. What the fuck does that even mean? He says that he works hand in hand with Goebbels. Yeah. Did you catch that?
They say that he says that the Comintern says that Hitler's victory is a step towards Thalmann, right? For the record, Ernst Thalmann was the Communist Party of Germany's.
I looked that up.
Yeah, okay, just making sure. Typically, you don't look things up. I'm sorry. But yes, Trotsky sucks, man.
As much as I don't want to just like dogpile and fall into the internet pattern of just shitting on Trotsky all the time, because I think there was really useful stuff in Permanent Revolution, especially. Yeah. I know you want to read Revolution Betrayed.
That's something that came to me. I think this made me want to read it a little bit more because I am interested in his analysis. But at the same time, I feel like we already know what he's going to say now.
How much of it is just going to be him sour grapes about Stalin?
All of it.
Yeah. And I know that his work on fascism is pretty much universally praised. Everyone that shits on Trotsky leaves at least that little asterisk. So like there is useful stuff in his theory and in his analysis. Just wish he wasn't such a whiny bitch about it all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe that's how we should do this one is, what did you find that was really good here? Like, what stood out to you is like, okay, this is something that we can take abstracted from Trotsky as a fucking cringe personality.
I have some, yes.
Yeah.
The expropriation and nationalization stuff I thought was really interesting. That starts on 194 and 195.
I'm there.
Okay. So, first of all, on the bottom of 194 at the start of this section, he kind of describes what expropriation is under a socialist program. He says the socialist program of expropriation, i.e. of political overthrow of the bourgeoisie and liquidation of its economic domination, should in no case during the present transitional period hinder us from advancing, when the occasion warrants, the demand for the expropriation of several key branches of industry vital for national existence or of the most parasitic group of the bourgeoisie. So he's kind of, one, defining what expropriation is for anyone that might not know, and two, saying that it is still an important part of this transitional program because you need to take those key pieces of the bourgeois liberal industry, whatever you want to say, and like make them an important part of the state. Mm-hmm. And then he starts talking about banks specifically.
Yeah.
I had the Paris Commune on my mind. Yep. On the bottom of 195, I thought this was great. He says, it is impossible to take a single serious step in the struggle against monopolistic despotism and capitalistic anarchy, which supplement one another in their work of destruction, if the commanding posts of banks are left in the hands of predatory capitalists. Yeah. Perhaps this is him just relearning the lesson of the Paris Commune over again, but where is the lie in that? Yeah. That is 100% correct, and I think it got me thinking a lot about what that would look like in modernity. Because if you can cut off capital, if you can seize the banks and cut off capital, you've won a large part of the battle right there.
Sure.
What that actually looks like, I have a lot of questions about.
Yeah, I think he does something to follow that up, though, even on the next page when he says, right at the top, the expropriation of the banks in no case implies the expropriation of bank deposits, right? That's a signal to the people. It's like, we are seizing the banks, but it's not like we're taking your money.
We're not taking your money.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, part of me was like, seizing the banks means you are taking the money, but the structure of the bank kind of remains because the way that banks work is they take your money anyway and use it. Mm-hmm. The owners of the bank use that money because they've leveraged it in the account, and it's also fucking insured and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So, by seizing the banks, they don't even need to take the deposits because the function of the bank is to allow the people in charge of the bank to use the money in the bank, right? I like that that's there because I feel like that's the kind of thing that people would say. That's like your gut reaction, like, you're taking my money. What are you expropriating? Are you against personal property? Like, all of that shit.
I want my toothbrush.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, they're going to come fucking, they're going to take the violin out of your child's hands or something. So yeah. But, he even kind of extends that idea to, I'm looking at the top of 194 here. I really liked this part where he's talking about the struggle against unemployment, right? Mm-hmm. He calls for a broad and bold organization of public works. And he expands the definition of public work. He says the workers should demand resumption of public utilities, of work in private businesses closed as a result of the crisis, right? So obviously there are industries that might be shuttered because of the revolution, because of crisis, because of uprising, whatever. And he's saying that we should take those industries, maybe consumer industries even, and recreate them, but in the control of the workers. And the reason he says that, this is part of the transition, is that having the workers run those smaller businesses, right, those smaller public works, that then trains them in, what they need to then run these larger industries, right? It's maybe like the banks or other critically national or national critical injury. Damn. Other big business, other nationalized critical industries.
There you go.
Boom. Yeah. Yeah, he says, thus the workers' control becomes a school for planned economy.
Yeah.
On the basis of the experience of control, the proletariat prepares itself for direct management of nationalized industry when the hour for that eventually rises. And that's something that I appreciate here. He is not assuming that a revolution means all the workers rise up, all the workers seize the mean of production. He, probably from experience, understands that a revolution is going to be a protracted struggle, right? Not everybody is going to coalesce into this one beautiful socialist party, fully collectivized and ready to press the communism button. And he knows that that's not the case. So I can give him credit for that at least. He's saying that just as we raise the consciousness of the people to create revolution, we have to raise the consciousness of the people to then manage these industries in the same way. The workers haven't had control in a long time. I'm not saying they can't, but it might be a bit of a change.
I was thinking about this in very kind of practical terms, trying to think about what this would look like in the modern Western world. And there are things like of course, seizing the banks. But there are, we've made mention of this in other episodes, there are other industries that are pretty much like turnkey ready to distribute important, vital things for the people if and when the revolution occurs. And the workers are already running those industries.
Yeah.
They're already doing 98% of the work that is necessary to like see them run as smoothly as they're running in this bourgeois capitalist economy. And so Bezos gets the guillotine and the workers still have that infrastructure that makes it very straightforward and easy to distribute goods to those that need it. And I agree, Trotsky deserves credit. The dude isn't talking from a purely abstract theoretical base. He's seen it, lived it, breathed it more than once.
Right.
And so he knows the good and the bad of what to expect out of a revolution like this. And so, you got to give that guy credit. I think he has a really good point.
Yes, I will push back on my own thing a little bit there.
Okay.
This is kind of my own critique here, is the idea that Trotsky's saying that he's saying a school for planned economy, right? We're teaching the workers how to manage the economy. Mm-hmm. What my issue with that is that the big industries that he's talking about the workers managing eventually are probably industries critical to the success of the state. Like if we're thinking about the bank is a great example. I mean, I know he says they're going to seize the banks for sure here, but it's like that's the kind of thing that must be seized. And that's, the question is like whether the workers are ready to control it or not. I think Trotsky brings that up needlessly because the idea, at the end of the day, these industries must be seized. They must be nationalized for the success of the state. I don't know where the time frame that Trotsky is talking about here. If he's talking about using these smaller industries as a staging ground to teach the workers how to control industry so that they can then, that knowledge can be applied to large, important, nationalized industries like the banks. The thing is, though, he's just said that those large nationalized industries are of utmost importance, right? They have to be taken over immediately.
Yeah.
So I don't understand what's the plan in the meantime. If you're saying that we have to train up these workers to run these institutions, what are you going to do with the institution you just seized? Maybe that's too nitty-gritty of a critique here, but it's just something I was thinking about because I'm sure Trotsky is aware of the reaction being part of the revolution, obviously.
Yeah.
So, I don't know I'm trying to understand his time frame for revolution here. You know what I mean?
I think I'm picking up what you're saying now. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that I came up with a clear answer based on this reading.
Yeah, maybe I'm being too nitpicky. One thing I do like, though, on 195 is that he says, only a general revolutionary upsurge of the proletariat can place the complete expropriation of the bourgeoisie on the order of the day. The task of the transitional demand is to prepare the proletariat to solve this problem. Mm-hmm. So that's something I really appreciate is that he's saying all workers of the world unite. We really have to raise the consciousness of every person, right? Leave no stone unturned.
Yep.
I can appreciate that.
Same. I wrote, I agree right next to that quote.
I agree. Yeah. So he talks about the bank. He talks about a workers' militia. I think that's completely reasonable. Nothing crazy there.
Yeah, I just started writing 2A next to all of this stuff in this section because, at least here in the United States, gun ownership has a tendency to be lumped together with a conservative ideology. And what I think is funny is the whole is in the middle. It's the moderates and the liberals that are the ones that are anti-gun. It's like when you look at leftist groups, they are very strongly in favor of being well-armed militias. And Trotsky is definitely pointing that out here. But this was one of those points where I just wrote, do they?
Yeah.
Question mark. Because he says on 197...
That's exactly what you're about to say.
The duty of the Fourth International is to put an end to such slavish policies once and for all. The petty bourgeois Democrats, including social democrats, Stalinists, and anarchists, yell louder about the struggle against fascism, the more cravenly they capitulate to it in actuality.
Yeah, just thinking back at the Parenti, we know that Stalin was actively preparing for global war.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is the case,
I feel strongly that it's not the case.
Right.
I just think it's sour grapes, man.
It
just, I get it to a degree. I would also be pretty bitter if I were Trotsky in this position, but maybe he just can't see past his own anger to recognize how much it's sowing his own undoing.
Yeah. Well, there's something about writing in exile. He has to be thoroughly frustrated. And I know that he's rebuilding his own coalition in the Fourth International, but again, we don't know the scope of that.
Yeah.
And regardless, I can't imagine it gave him much satisfaction. I mean, he was ultimately politically powerless until his death. He was in exile. He couldn't form a new base or anything. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. There's some further reading to be done, perhaps, not necessarily on the podcast, but maybe on my own time, just what was the scope of the Fourth International. There are still Trotskyist groups that exist to this day. The Socialist Workers' Party, which, whatever. They're running a candidate for president, right now. Not on every ballot, that's for sure.
Yeah.
I won't even be able to vote for the PSL candidate, man, because Georgia took him to court, or they're taking Georgia to court because Georgia wouldn't let him on the ballot. Yeah.
There's your freedom right there.
Yeah,
freedom
exactly.
of choice.
Sorry. But I agree with you. I do like his point here about creating workers groups for self-defense, but that was already that was already part of the memo, That was already, we were talking about that already.
Yeah, I don't know. I associated that with Lenin, with State and Revolution. I don't know if that was a Trotsky thing that Lenin picked up or if that was a Lenin thing that Trotsky picked up.
I mean, it comes before, he says on 198, Engels defines the state as bodies of armed men. So
that's true. Yeah,
we're creating the state by, and absolutely Lenin said the same thing. I mean, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But this does transition us to the alliance of the workers and the farmers. And this was, by and large, the most interesting part of this text in my mind.
I would agree.
In large part because I'm approaching this thinking about what does this look like in the modern era in the United States specifically, which does have a very large stake in agriculture. And I think a lot of the resistance you'll hear for folks on the right specifically, or even conservative liberals, is going to be tied up with this sort of thing with farmers and their land and what they're doing. It's so much in the United States. So many farmers rely on subsidies, and so once you start changing the state apparatus, it's going to completely change the way that they make their living. And so, there's an important conversation that needs to be had.
Sure. Also, to say that it's still tinged. Two things, actually. First, I'll say that just to kind of lay out what he's saying by the Workers and Farmers Alliance, right, is that we should be dealing with the peasantry as well, but he's talking specifically about the lower class. And a part of me thinks that he's chopping it up for no reason. If we're talking about the proletariat of the farming section and the proletariat of the industrial section, then we're just talking about the proletariat. It seems unnecessary to create a workers and farmers alliance in this sense because we're talking to the proletariat everywhere. We're talking about the people that don't have ownership of the means of production. That also extends to the agricultural industry. So I don't know why he's necessarily making that distinction. And then I do know why he's making that distinction, because he is against Stalin, right? He says here that there shouldn't be forced collectivization. We should rehabilitate the image of socialism in the eyes of the farmer. And again, he's not talking about the middle class, the petit bourgeois. He's talking about the proletarian class in the farming industry. And again, it's because he's just anti-Stalin, not for bad reason. I mean, I know a little bit that during the collectivization process, there were farmers that would burn their crops rather than subject them to
collectivization.
Yeah, it's not without reason. The thing there is, it's about bread again, right? Even with forced collectivization, they had famine in Russia, right? It doesn't really sit well with me. And I think that his whole message here is a reaction. It's a reaction to Stalin and Stalin's policies. And not that it's without merit, but I think that does weigh a little bit on it for me.
That's definitely in there. The anti-Stalin stuff is definitely in there. I think if I were to zoom out, to speak of it more globally, I agree that talking about the, quote, peasantry class that are working in the fields, working the farms, and the proletarian class that are working in industry in the more urban environments, you're talking about workers, you're talking about proletarians either way.
Yeah.
I agree with that. But for whatever reason, he and Lenin and everybody else makes a pretty big distinction between the two of them. And I was thinking about it, you mentioned the petit bourgeois, because I think in the United States, a lot of farmers would probably qualify as petit bourgeois. They own the means of the production on their farm.
Yeah.
And so, there is an interesting distinction that needs to be made there with building coalition. It probably does need to change the way we talk about proletarians.
Just to push back on that a little bit, though, I think that many of those people that we're perceiving as petit bourgeois are not in control of their means of production. They are more proletarianized than we expect. And I was thinking about John Deere tractors. If you need to get a John Deere tractor fixed, you have to ship it off. You have to have someone licensed come out and fix it. In fact, I saw a bunch of news articles in the last couple of years about people jailbreaking their tractors, so they could actually do something with them because they were otherwise licensed to John Deere. And that's a perfect example of the way that they aren't in control of the means of production. I mean, they might own the land specifically, but I don't know, that's the kind of thing that I think some empirical analysis might need to be done for.
An example like that, though, feels like a really good example of how someone that is leasing that tractor or whatever would see themselves as being the owner of the means of production, where it requires a level of class consciousness for them to recognize that they're not.
Oh, I think they recognize it. I think they recognize it all
well,
right.
that example specifically, I know it caused a huge uproar or whatever, but I don't know. It leads me to think that maybe there does need to be a way that we activate them as part of the coalition differently. And I mean, Trotsky is talking specifically about even granting them difference in like the way that they choose to run their farms. They can kind of elect to collectivize or not.
Yeah, there's something to be said there. I actually was favorable to his description of voluntary collectivization.
Yeah.
But only in the way that he's saying that they still end up relying on the state. I mean, it seems actually messier than I would like. You know, I'm thinking about efficiency. I'm thinking about what it's going to take to create the bread for everybody in this fucking nation, especially a nation like Russia, right? Can they get away with that? You know, I don't know. Maybe that's too rooted. What I'm thinking is like, can we allow that to happen and still create enough for everybody, right? What are those people doing with their product? Are they selling it to just the state? Is there still an open market? There's a lot of, like, it sounds great to say, yeah, we should have a voluntary system where the people ultimately choose. But the thing is, his influence on them choosing is by having them be ultimately reliant on the state. And it's like, if that's the case, they might as well be considered nationalized. It's just that we're giving them the air of non-nationalization. We're creating an inefficiency in their industry by allowing them to do that.
Well, I mean, maybe this is a bastardization of the term, but that is kind of a transitional form that makes it maybe easier for them to become proletarianized, because like, that's the reality right now. I think most farmers in the United States probably consider themselves masters of their own destiny or whatever when they're
the most
entirely
subsidized
reliant on
industry in the whole fucking world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so like they see themselves as being separated from it, even though they are reliant on it. And there's some massaging that needs to happen.
I actually see that a little bit. It's like, yeah, you're autonomous. Big wink.
Yeah.
You know, yeah, you got it. Come over whenever you're ready, you know? Yeah. Okay.
Because someone that working in any other industry where you have a boss that you answer to directly or whatever, that's like looking over your shoulder, micromanaging everything that you do, it's a lot easier to see yourself as proletarian in that regard.
Now, here's the thing, though, is that if we're allowing that structure to exist, then what happens if those businesses like fail per se? You know, if you don't submit to collectivization and then your farm fails, then what? You're not subsidized by the government still, right? Do they let you suffer for it? Do they force you into another industry? I don't know. It seems half-baked to me is the thing.
Yeah.
And I absolutely agree with you that it makes sense as a transitional step. I can give Trotsky some credit there, but there's still some things to it that make me a little uncomfortable.
That's fair. I mean, at what point does it become a means of national interest to seize a failing farm, for example?
Yeah. And on top of that, I mean, it feels like liberal opportunism to me. You know, it feels like Trotsky purposely avoiding the idea that there needs to be one body, one party.
Maybe he's just so anti-Stalin that he's looking for some way to
I don't know,
do it differently.
I think that there's a couple times in here where he's playing both sides. Like I mentioned earlier, how he says that there should be free association for parties, like workers should be able to choose what party they vote for, but then at the same time he demands democratic centralism. It's like that democratic centralism means one party, not multiple parties here.
Yeah, I picked up a little bit of that. I was a little confused with that line where he says that they should be able to vote for whatever party.
Yeah.
Because he's talking about the Soviets at that point.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, which of these little cadres, coalitions are you going to support? But then how is that centralism?
I could see it in like a caucus sense, you know, like we're all in one party, but we're kind of all the workers, you know, we're like the farmers that all hang out together. But at what point does that devolve into factionalism? I mean, that was something that like the Soviet Union specifically struggled with. And I know that, I mean, this might be Stalinist apologia, but like that's the kind of thing that he was working against. I don't want to say working against because he did purges. Okay. It was violent, but factionalism still definitely something that we might want to be avoiding. You know what I mean? Especially because it kind of undercuts the democratic centralism tenet. You know what I'm saying there?
Yeah, I'm picking up what you're laying down. I still have a little bit to say about this alliance of the workers and the farmers.
Absolutely. What page are we on? I closed my book.
I'm on 198 right now. Trotsky specifically calls them petty bourgeois. He says the peasants or farmers represent another class. They are the petty bourgeois of the village. The petty bourgeois is made up of various layers from the semi-proletarian to the exploiter elements. In accordance with this, the political task of the industrial proletariat is to carry the class struggle into the country. Only thus will it be able to draw a dividing line between its allies and its enemies. And I think that that's a really interesting thing. It reminded me a little bit of the mass line, to be honest, about like, well, there's something in there about education, about class consciousness and education. And I'm thinking about that in the context of U.S. politics. Again, when you're talking about farmers, you're almost always talking about a tendency toward conservatism, which, again, greatly ironic to be like small government minded and be so reliant on government subsidies is a contradiction that's very difficult to write. But nonetheless, there is a need. I do think that like there is a charge for those proletarians with class consciousness to educate the farmers and the peasantry to see which side of this fight are you going to fall on, because those lines need to be demarcated.
Yeah. I like what you said about the mass line. It's like you're going out and meeting the people where they are, you know, the country surrounds the city. Like,
yeah.
So it makes sense. It makes sense.
Well, okay, so where to start with this alliance of workers and farmers? Trotsky says on the top of 199, while the farmer remains an independent petty producer, he is in need of cheap credit, of agricultural machines and fertilizer at prices he can afford to pay, favorable conditions of transport, and conscientious organization of the market for his agricultural products. So he gives us some pretty clear spaces where there is leverage for this coalition between the industrial proletarians and the peasantry, because like the farmer again might see themselves as independent, but they need all of these things, and these are the doors that are left open for us to build coalition. And I was thinking a lot about people in my own family, for example, where at the bottom of 199 he says, by this means the workers will be able to prove to the farmers that the real reason for high prices is not high wages, but the exorbitant profits of the capitalists and the overhead expenses of capitalist anarchy. Because I've been hearing a lot lately from some folks around me.
Yeah.
Things like, well, things weren't so expensive under Trump. And it's like shit like that is a clear indication of a lack of class consciousness, but it is a door that's open to build that consciousness.
Yeah. No, I what I'm thinking of right now is like my total conspiracy brain was like, were these businesses just jacking up their prices to injure Biden? Like, were they creating Bidenflation so it could be used as an attack against him?
I mean, probably.
I don't want to assume that, but I can't help it. I can't help but assume that, you know?
I think worst case scenario, it was entirely orchestrated, manipulated. Best case scenario,
accidental coincidence.
On accident. Yeah.
Either way, though. Yeah. I mean, because it's not inflation at the end of the day. It was just fucking corporate greed.
Yeah.
Like literally, yes.
Exactly. But people don't talk about it in that sort of way because they lack that education and that consciousness.
Yeah. And also, I mean, it might be an example of the kind of reaction that we're talking about, you know? What I'm thinking of is like, say we were to seize the state apparatus or whatever, and then suddenly all of these businesses started experiencing higher prices because the corporations in charge of those prices are jacking it up to create the image that the state is, you know, anti-worker or anti-farmer or whatever. I mean, that's something that we have to reckon with. And I like that Trotsky here is saying like we should make it clear. We should take every step we can to make it clear that those issues are not coming from our lovely socialism, but instead from the true enemy, you know?
That's where that transparency comes in. And again, like that's, if you want to win over farmers, find a way to lower the price of grain, find the way to lower offer them more credit, you know, find these sorts of opportunities that can create coalition.
Yeah, in that same quote, this is on page 200, when he's talking about the dependence on the state, replacing the dependence on private capital I was talking about, he says the state will be more attentive to the needs of its coworkers and agents. More firmly, the toilers themselves keep the state in their own hands. So he's saying that they have to be more open to the problems of the consumer than the private industry is, you know, and by doing so, they will rehabilitate the image of socialism in the eyes of the farmer.
Exactly. I think that that's really valid because tell anyone that you're a communist and see the reaction that you get. Like it's quite clear that not re-education isn't the word I want to use, but like
it's re-education. It's re-education. Yeah. No, but I absolutely agree with you. I mean, it has to be a part of their conscience that we're there to help them, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a pragmatic approach, I will say that.
We have a common enemy and it's not one another. I also was making this connection on 202 when he starts talking about pacifism.
Yeah.
He says, in addition, it is necessary to differentiate strictly between the pacifism of the diplomat, professor, journalist, and the pacifism of the carpenter, agricultural worker, and the charwoman. Side note, I found at least 2 typos in this. So
Lovely.
Trotskyists, being the writers that they are, producing this book with at least 2 typos. No big deal. Okay, and the charwoman. In one case, pacifism is a screen for imperialism. In the other, it is the confused expression of distrust in imperialism.
I highlighted the next sentence there because I think that explained it to me the most.
Okay.
Where he says, the small farmer speaks about defense. They're talking about, like, literally defense. The defense of the home, the defense of whatever.
Exactly.
But the posturing for defense from the bourgeois here is not defense at all. It's, in fact, preparation for war, right? It's preparation for imperialism. It's creating the foundation for expansion, not defense even a little bit. It's a different kind of pacifism.
I see a connection there.
Okay.
In the pacifism and even patriotism of the oppressed, there are elements which reflect, on the one hand, a hatred of destructive war, and on the other, a clinging to what they believe to be their own good.
Yeah.
Elements which we must know how to seize upon in order to draw the requisite conclusions. That's the quote I wanted to read.
That believing in their own, what's good.
Exactly, yeah, because there is a hatred of the destruction of war,
right,
which I do think can be found in that kind of realm of conservatism.
Yeah.
It's not all nationalistic patriotism that like blindly follows that sort of stuff. But they do believe in the idea of the military industrial complex being there to protect the elements that they feel need to be protected.
Yeah.
And so, like, there is something there that can be seized upon that can help with this kind of education and consciousness building that can create a coalition between the proletarians and the peasantry.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's easy to weave it in together with the defense of the revolution as a whole. It's like, here's the gains that we have seized. That's the defense that you're looking for. It's not the idea that we're going to expand this outwards. What really spoke to me there was the hatred of destructive war, right? Even the most fervent hawk, if you were to flip the script and say, what if the war was here? I'm sure they would say no, Like, nobody wants to fight a defensive war. Nobody wants to be invaded, right? I mean, that's the kind of thing that they're talking about. I don't know. That just really spoke to me there.
Can we go to 207? Talking about Stalin.
By all means.
The very top of 207, he says, the experience of Russia demonstrated in the experience of Spain and France once again confirms that even under very, very favorable conditions, the parties of petty bourgeois democracy, and he calls out SR, Social Democrats, Stalinist anarchists, are incapable of creating a government of workers and peasants that is a government independent of the bourgeoisie. Isn't it kind of crazy to call Stalin's USSR petty bourgeois democracy?
Yeah, I mean,
like,
I think it is, especially because not like fucking just a little bit later in the book where he talks about how, like, even in the concept of the degenerated worker state, he's saying that, like, the revolution produced socialized gains and they still exist. Maybe you're acting a little sectarian here, Trotsky. I don't know what to tell you, man.
It seeps into every bit of this text in a way that just, like, really leaves you with discomfort.
Well, it's because we're neutral here. It's not neutral, obviously. But, yeah, like, these little jabs are for other trots. It's for other fucking people that are like, yeah, fuck you, Stalin, you petty bourgeois Democrat. It's like, I'm seeing more fucking bourgeois liberalism in what Trotsky's saying here than in, I don't know that much about what Stalin has done in this period, but yeah, I don't know, man.
Yeah, it's sour grapes. I don't know any other way to say it.
Yeah.
The section on the Soviets was the last thing that I really had anything meaningful on.
Yeah, on fucking, this was a huge bunch here.
Yeah.
215 and onwards.
Okay. Yeah, I'm even a little ahead of that. On 210 and 211 is where I was starting.
All right. Is his international proletarianism really just paternalistic imperialism? Maybe my question here.
Say more about that.
It's something the way he just talks about the colonial struggle here that didn't quite sit well with me.
That's where I was kind of coming at it from, is there seemed to be something underlying it that made me a little uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Where he's talking about the colonial and semi-colonial countries, and he starts calling them backward countries, which inherently, I don't love that phrasing.
Sure.
But he says their development, therefore, has a combined character. The most primitive economic forms are combined with the last word in capitalist technique and culture. And the struggle for the most elementary achievements of national independence and bourgeois democracy is combined with the socialist struggle against world imperialism.
Yeah. No, I like that.
Yeah, I'm good with that. I think that's the internationalist take.
I think it's also part of his permanent revolutionary ideal where he's saying, like, first you have to throw off the... It's weird because it's not that he's talking about developmental stages here. I'm looking at on 210, the central task of the colonial and semi-colonial countries is the agrarian revolution, i.e. the liquidation of feudal heritages, and then national independence, the overthrow of the imperialist yoke. So he is talking about a process, right? The feudal system, then the imperialist system, and then capitalism. Mm-hmm. But I was still seeing that within like the permanent revolutionary ideal, where he's saying that like answering these questions, you have to have socialist answers to answer these questions. I just don't know. I just don't know how I feel about it.
Yeah, he does kind of get to that. He says on 211, nevertheless, the general trend of revolutionary development in all backward countries can be determined by the formula of the permanent revolution in the sense definitely imparted to it by the 3 revolutions in Russia.
Yeah.
So he's saying, like, here's the blueprint. It's been laid out.
Yeah.
All other colonial or semi-colonial countries can throw off the yoke and follow these steps to find their way there, which is fine. But then this is where he starts getting into his kind of wrought historicism about the Comintern. Like on 211, I just wrote, like, I don't know enough of the history to know where I stand on this, because it's quite clearly coming from a biased perspective. Yeah. He's very clearly got a position on this analysis.
Yeah, it's not for me to say that the material conditions for revolution were there or not there in 1925 through 27 China. One thing that kind of was a little odd to me was a little further down, he says, after the masses had been smashed by the Kuomintang, the Comintern organized a caricature of Soviet in Canton. Following the inevitable collapse of the Canton Uprising, the Comintern took the road of guerrilla warfare of peasant Soviets. I don't know if the Comintern did that, you know? I mean, I know that communist China was in direct contact with Stalin for a lot of things. Really, really tough to say, because I don't know if, this is where my history knowledge is sparse here, right? It almost makes me think of, like, Stalin versus the Nazis, you know, because China was being invaded by Japan, right? Could the communists in China afford not to have a popular front with the Kuomintang versus nationalist Japan? I know in the Permanent Revolution episode, I agreed with Trotsky when I said that this popular frontism led to the destruction of communists, but I don't know enough to say whether it was necessary to defeat Japan in this case. You know, same in Spain, honestly. I definitely, just of hearing George Orwell's description of the anarchists, I do not think the anarchists had a fucking fighting chance to stop the fascists in Spain. So what's the alternative, right? It's a popular front or fascism. Maybe that's too reductive of a way to say that, but I don't know. Both of these examples are poor because there is a direct threat of imperialism and fascism to the communists. It's like the lesser of two evils here, and I can understand why Trotsky's saying that the Popular Front led to their downfall. Historically, it did, but they...
What was the other option?
Japan, right? The other option in Spain was Franco, and that's what happened.
Yeah.
Again, I don't know. Like, I don't know if Stalin's interference, quote-unquote, maybe that's even too much leeway to Trotsky there, but is his intervention in Spain the cause of the failure of the communists? I don't know. I know in China they beat the Japanese back. And then the communists went on to win in a civil war. Yeah, they were quashed by the Kuomintang, and they had the Long March. Then they reorganized in Yunnan.
Yeah, this is one of the spaces where I am most dreadfully left unread. It's been my experience that most communists are history buffs or historians, like literally.
Or they like to think about it, at least.
Yeah, and so like they know all of this sort of stuff. For me, as mentioned way back when in the first episode, like, this is a much more intuitive thing. I feel like communism is a way to create the most justice. So it's like, I'm not coming at it from a historical perspective. I'm not looking at these things that happened and becoming radicalized by the history. I don't know the history. I became radicalized elsewhere.
Yeah.
So like, these are all big blank spots for me and my understanding. And so like, I kind of glazed over a lot of this stuff with Trotsky's retelling of it because I'm assuming that it's coming from an ardently anti-Stalinist perspective.
Yeah.
And so, like, it's going to be colored one way already. And so, like, I just don't know enough to know what to say back to it.
It just reminds me of that Tony Febo quote from fucking Black Shirts and Reds, where... by the way, Tony Febo does not exist.
Yeah, I remember you saying you tried to look
Tony
him up.
Febo does not exist. I even went into the Guardian archive to see if they had profiles on him or anything. He does not exist. Regardless, where he says, you know, why do we chalk it up to the leaders? Why is it always the assumption that if we had given the workers more control, they would have done correctly? Like, giving the communists direct control here, I don't know if that would have led to their success. The same thing I just said.
Yeah, I don't know. The point I somehow was trying to get to here previously is that his whole retelling of the Soviets, and as problematic or as it might be, or how it might leave some open questions that create contradictions that we're not seeing how he's resolved.
Not seeing.
Not seeing.
Not seeing.
I do think that there's something interesting, remembering that I'm coming from this without a great historical base to build upon. So maybe this is a really dumb idea, but I've been thinking a lot about like what would a socialist revolution look like in the United States? And I don't see a popular uprising of the workers really catching steam nationally. I think what is going to happen is that there's going to be a coalition where something happens in a small scale. And if they do it, if they're organized enough, if we're strong enough, if we're smart enough with enough foresight, maybe that will create similar reactions around the United States where eventually those coalitions, there will be enough of them that we could build one grander coalition that could see the revolution fulfilled.
Sure.
And I feel like there's something in his description of the way the Soviets were working that feels like it could work here. It's almost like there's something to be learned there for a strategy for the United States. Where that is exactly, I'm not 100% sure.
I have some thoughts on coalition. I'm thinking back to Lenin when he says that coalition, he says, we cannot imagine the conquest of power without coalition. It's just that the coalition must be one that is centered around our ability to present these ideals. It has to be maximalist. And I think that that's still valid. Like, I don't think anyone is saying that we can't do coalition, right? I don't know what Trotsky's distinction is here when he's talking about the Popular Front, right? Is it the fact, well, I guess it is the fact that those coalitions have been forced to give up their primary motive, which is to spread class consciousness, right? To arm the proletariat.
It says they're opportunistic.
Yeah, and I guess that makes sense, but it's that same thing, though. Trotsky even says that the workers under fascism are much less likely to be able to create anything. That Popular Front was against the fascists. Like, I'm now even, like, when I read this the first time, I didn't make these connections, but right now I'm just like, what the fuck are you talking about, Trotsky? Like, historically speaking, these coalitions were to prevent fascists from happening. The very thing you say is less likely to create the conditions for communism.
Yeah.
So what the fuck? Fuck off.
Yeah. If you're arguing with anti-fascists, you're on the wrong side.
He does that. He says, like, what are the grand tenets of the big anti-fascist coalition? And I was like, beating the Nazis.
Number one,
they beat the Nazis, and they did. They did. Because of Stalin's buildup and collectivization, might I say.
I give Stalin tremendous credit for the defeat of the Nazis.
I do too. It's really because of Lend-Lease. They would never have survived. No, I'm fucking joking. I think that we're tiptoeing around the fact that this sucks.
Yeah, kind of.
I don't know. Like, I'm really trying to give Trotsky more credit than he deserves here, I think.
Perhaps that's true. He does know how to turn a phrase. There are a few banger quotes in here.
Yeah, you want to do the cavalcade?
Yeah, fuck it. Let's just jump right into the cavalcade of quotes.
One that I loved on page 214, the revolutionary wave in fascist countries will immediately be a grandiose sweep and under no circumstance will stop short at the experiment of resuscitating some sort of Weimar corpse. I like that.
Yeah. On 185, he did say something that made me think about our talk about climate communism. All the talk to the effect that historical conditions have not yet ripened for socialism is the product of ignorance or conspicuous deception. The objective prerequisites for the proletarian revolution have not only ripened, they have begun to get somewhat rotten. Without a socialist revolution in the next historical period at that, a catastrophe threatens the whole culture of mankind. He was kind of right.
Yeah, no joke,
Kind of right. So yeah, definitely a precursor to some climate communism there.
If capitalism is incapable of satisfying the demands arising from the calamities generated by itself, then let it perish.
I actually wrote "Let It Perish," and I have that dog-eared in it. I was like, I might write a song.
There you go.
Let It Perish.
Let it perish.
I'm uncomfortable with Trotskyist associations at this point in my reading with Trotsky now, so maybe I won't, but I did think about that.
I mean,
it'd be a good song title.
I've avoided pulling clips from the Permanent Revolution episode because I don't want to come off like we're Trots, But here's the thing. This is actually an interesting conversation. You're LARPing, not you. There's no Trotskyists. There's no Stalinists. Like, what are we fucking talking about here? No one is saying, like, let's implement Stalin's program right now. Let's implement Trotsky's program right now. We're all talking about programs for communism. I mean, I don't know. Is it silly to have these divides? This is a personal beef between two dickheads. Why are we letting it affect us now, fucking 80 years later?
I have been thinking about that after reading this. I've been thinking about opportunism, I guess, in general, or falling into reformism or entaillism or something, but like there's something to be said about finding the people with which you have things in common, not to be like just turn this into a conversation about left unity or whatever, but like Trots and Stalinists have a lot in common. If you consider yourself a Stalinist or you consider yourself a Trotskyist, you should be in coalition with one another and work through those things as you develop and organize.
When you said that, though, if you consider yourself a Stalinist, you consider yourself a Trotskyist, you're probably too far gone.
But I mean, like, I don't know. It feels like very...
If you consider yourself a Stalinist, talk to me when you graduate high school.
It feels very like mired in academia. It's like your feet aren't even on the fucking ground.
Yeah.
Like you're just floating in the clouds. If you're getting that caught up with like differences like this, like, yes, you should have principled conversations about what is the right policy and the wrong policy, but you shouldn't let that create division among a coalition.
Interesting. It's almost like you're calling for freedom of thought and then unity of action. Do we have a term for that, perhaps? Like, that's exactly what I'm thinking. It's like, this is fucking ridiculous, you know? Is the ice pick that much of a divide?
That's what I mean. I mean, like, I've not come into any of this with a strong sense of trot apologia or whatever. But, like, I do have a strong reaction to the anti-Trot sentiment that you see all over the internet.
Yeah.
Because it just seems like punching down, one.
Right.
But, like, two, it's like, what do you hope to gain from that? Like, what is the goal of, like, shitting on Trotsky and making ice pick jokes all of the time? Like, it's fun once in a while,
funny,
right?
yeah.
But, like, how does that help? What is that doing? You know, like, best case scenario, you're taking someone that's a Trot.
You're isolating them more.
Exactly.
Well,
like,
okay, yeah. I was going to say, in a way that they isolate themselves, Stalinists do the same thing.
It just seems silly to me. I don't know. I mean,
it does seem silly to me. And I mean, to most people that aren't completely online leftists, I'm sure it does seem completely silly. Maybe not actual Trotskyists. But the thing is, Trotskyist groups remain, you know? Like,
that's true.
There are still Trotskyist groups out there. What I was going to say, though, is that they're fucking freaks. They're, like, completely deformed, you know? They're crazy weirdos, you know? All the ones that are, like, still existing have, like, morphed into some really weirdo stuff.
I can't say why that would have happened or whatever, but I'm certain, like, the isolationism that comes along with, like, being...
a niche of a niche, you know?
I'm sure that those things thrive in those sorts of scenarios. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like,
same with the Maoist sects. I mean, sects. TS. Yeah, I mean, same thing. It's like they isolated themselves because they thought they had the right line. You know, they had read one more book and then they were like, I'm correct. And so they created smaller and smaller circles until the completely insular, you know, Christianity happened, basically.
I have, for example, a very good friend that's an anarchist. And when we talk about stuff like this, it's like we have the exact same end goal in mind. Where we have a difference of opinion is how we're going to reach that.
Yeah.
But, like, that's not a reason for us to be divided in our movement toward that goal. It just seems like, I don't know, like really divisive. I can't think of a better word.
Yeah. On the flip side, though, I will say Trotsky's theory is obviously hurt by himself, by him. You know, it's hurt.
Oh, yeah.
It's hurt by fucking sour grapes, just like you said. This was a turnoff for Trotsky. Sorry.
Yep. On 191, if it be criminal to turn one's back on mass organizations for the sake of fostering sectarian fictions, it is no less so to passively tolerate subordination of the revolutionary mass movement to the control of openly reactionary or disguised conservative bureaucratic cliques. I just liked that. He was right on 192, where he says, liberal capitalism based upon competition and free trade has completely receded into the past. Its successor, monopolistic capitalism, not only does not mitigate the anarchy of the market, but on the contrary, imparts it to a particularly convulsive character.
Yeah, I loved where he says that there is control in the economy. Don't let anyone fucking fool you with the invisible hand. Mm-hmm. Every bourgeois tendency has tried to control the anarchy of production, whether that's, you know, some kind of planning, right? Oh, sorry, he says, I'll just read it. With the fascists, it's mainly a question of planned plundering of people for military purposes. The social democrats prepare to drain the ocean of anarchy with spoonfuls of bureaucratic planning. Engineers and professors write articles about technocracy, and in their cowardly experiments and regulations, democratic governments run head-on into the invincible sabotage of big capital. It's like, there's no lie there. You know, that's exactly right. To say that this is the free market is a fucking farce.
Exactly.
Nothing free about it.
He's being quite transparent as he wishes everyone to be.
Yeah.
Oh, on 205, he does drop this kind of banger line when he's talking about racism and anti-Semitism.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Before exhausting or drowning mankind in blood, capitalism befouls the world atmosphere with the poisonous vapors of national and race hatred. That's a fucking bar.
Yeah. The most malignant convulsions of capitalism's death agony.
Yeah.
Very good.
On 213, this is my last cavalcade of quotes.
Okay.
Near the bottom, he says, irresistibly, the molecular preparation of the proletarian revolution proceeds beneath the heavy totalitarian tombstone. It's just a good turn of phrase. I like that.
Totalitarian tombstone.
Yeah, he's really hitting the consonants there, so with that alliteration.
Yeah, I actually highlighted the very next line.
Oh, of course.
But for concealed energy to flare into open revolt, it is necessary that the vanguard of the proletariat find new perspectives, a new program, and a new unblemished banner. What banner, you might add? Well, I just started a new one myself. The pure, proper proletarian organization, the Fourth International, right? He even says, are we weak? Yes. Really good.
Yeah.
Really good. But again, just to say, new perspectives, new program, new whatever, but Soviets are the only conceivable model. Nobody's come up with a better one yet. I'm not saying that Soviets aren't the mood or anything, but just a little bit wishy-washy there, man.
Yeah. I suppose I do have one more quote for the cavalcade.
Yeah, hit me.
On 217, it's the bottom of the second paragraph there. He says, from them, i.e. from the right, we can expect ever more determined attempts in the next period to revise the socialist character of the USSR and bring it closer to pattern to Western civilization in its fascist form. Now, first of all, again, you can't separate this from his obvious beef with Stalin and him kind of making a connection there between Stalin and fascism.
Yeah.
But he is pointing out something that is true and I think is useful to be very wary about and to be very vigilant in our defense against, and that is the ratchet effect. Like, this kind of comes back full circle to what we were saying at the very start of the show, where, like, if your main goal is a compromise, you're going to get a compromise from that compromise.
Yeah.
And then your next goal will be a compromise of that compromise's compromise. And eventually, it doesn't take too long for you to be so far away from your original intention that it's not even fair to say that that was a goal of yours to begin with. This is what happens with the divide between the supposed left and right in United States bipartisan politics. The left just continues to be ratcheted farther and farther right. As the right moves right, the left moves right. And so what we're getting is the Democrats running in 2024 having a pretty similar position to George W. Bush
really cool.
running at the turn of the century. That is something we need to be very vigilant in defense against.
Yeah, you need to build the broadest fucking coalition you can without compromising your ideals. That's really it. Like, that's it, you know? Yep. You have to be as broad as possible and not opportunistic. And failure to do that works in both directions. I think that, you can ratchet it left and left and left and create an ever smaller and smaller group, and that defeats the purpose because it's not a mass movement at that point, Yeah, much in the same way, though, reform doesn't do anything. Yep. It made me think of when we were reading Rosa Luxemburg, and she said, don't laugh. Rosa Luxemburg, right, Luxemburg, Rosa Luxemburg. No, sorry. When she says that there is not an unbroken chain of reform. It's not like step, step, step. You are looking out at the darkness. Like, what direction do I need to take? Oh, I did like 220. The Fourth International does not search after and does not invent panaceas. It takes its stand completely on Marxism as the only revolutionary doctrine that enables one to understand reality, unearth the cause behind the defeats, and consciously prepare for victory. That was it. We're not looking for the silver bullet. We have a pretty fucking solid idea of what needs to be done. It's just a matter of fucking doing it.
Yeah. He continues, he says, in a society based upon exploitation, the highest morality is that of the social revolution.
Yeah. All methods are good, which raise the class consciousness of the worker.
Yep.
We're in the modern era, but I will say that Trotsky does say, open the road to the woman worker, open the road to the youth. That's par for the course at this point. but it is 1938, so something to be said there.
Yeah, and his analysis of that is relatively progressive in that he's seeing the labor of women in the home as being like an exploited class. They're an exploited class of laborers, and they need to be taken seriously.
It was so progressive, I didn't highlight any of it because I was like, this is perfectly in line with where we are today.
What questions did this text leave you with?
The transitional program as an idea, I think, is an interesting one. I'm curious to see what other kinds of transitional programs were put into place. Specifically, Lenin, then Mao, whatever happened in Vietnam and Laos, I guess. What questions did you have, Aaron?
Yes, so as already mentioned, there's a lot of kind of history that Trotsky is mentioning here that I don't know anything about. Or I certainly don't know enough about to recognize where he's being biased in his sour grapes and where he might have a reasonable analysis of the historical events. It's all kind of coming around that. Specifically on the top of page 200, Trotsky writes, in order to rehabilitate the program of socialism in the eyes of the farmer, it is necessary to expose mercilessly the Stalinist methods of collectivization, which are dictated not by the interests of the farmers or workers, but by the interests of the bureaucracy. And this collectivization comes up all of the time. This is pretty much the largest criticism lobbed against Stalin.
Largest?
Well, like his handling of the famine and the Holodomor.
Yeah, which is the famine.
Yeah, so like, I just don't know enough about it. I know that a lot of Ukrainians are really mad at Stalin because of what happened during the Holodomor or whatever. I don't know how much of that was Stalin's doing, how much of it was out of his control.
Yeah. Like
you already mentioned, there were farmers that were burning their crops, exacerbating the famine.
Yeah.
And so, like, I just don't know enough about the historical truth around this situation to know where my analysis should really fall, because everything that I think I know shows that there was a historical event that created a famine. Stalin was sending food into these places to try to quell that famine, and people died. And so that to me reads as Stalin reacting as best as he could to a historical situation, an event that was happening. But at the same time, there are purges, there are other things that are happening, and it's quite clear that Trotsky has an opinion about what happened, which I know I can't take at face value.
Right.
And it's like, I need to know more about this. My question is, what really happened, and where can I find that information?
There's a great video I'll send you from a person I've been watching about Sovietology, just like the study of Soviet history overall. Mm-hmm. And the problem is that I don't think we'll ever fucking know. All the records that could be available to us about the Holodomor are available, right? And historians still cannot agree. One thing I know for sure from this video specifically is that not every area in Ukraine suffered from famine. There were places that had very little issue with food security. Mm-hmm. And to me, at least, that says that there wasn't a genocidal intent there, And that might be too callous, but I don't know. The history there is really tough. What I think speaks to me the most is the fact that the Holodomor is posited as a double Holocaust thing. It's set up in parallel to the Holocaust to try to demonize the Soviets. Regardless, do I think that Stalin had the intent to kill Ukrainians? I don't. Okay. Do I know that for a fact? No. Right. And so, it is tricky. I absolutely agree with you. Here's the thing, too, is that any book we read is going to be fucking biased in one way or the other.
That's the nature of this whole thing, I guess. But it makes it really difficult to know where you should stand on the theory when the practical application of that theory is so propagandized. And it's like, so is democratic centralism the way to go if this is a potential byproduct of that? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But is it really a byproduct?
Yeah, is it really a byproduct?
Probably not, but how do you know? It just creates so many questions in my mind, and I don't know enough about it, and I frankly don't know that I'm going to live long enough to have read everything I need to read to know it with any, real certainty. Yeah. Here's another sub-question. Is that even a worthwhile endeavor?
Right.
Is that a worthy way to spend my time? Because I'm already on the side of it. You know what I mean? Like reading more about the history of it is probably not going to do much to change my
On the side of
allegiance to it.
collectivization, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah,
not
on
the
side of-
Holodomor. Yes, I absolutely agree with you, right? That's really all I can leave it at, you know? And here's the thing, dude, is I think we are ideologically tinged at this point regardless, you know? It's hard for us to separate the truth versus what we want to believe.
Yeah, some echo chamber or something like that.
Yeah. And here's the thing, too. If, like, a paper came out tomorrow that was like, Dear XYZ, I, Stalin, decided to kill all the Ukrainians, love Stalin, then...
Dear Diary.
Yeah, Dear Diary, I fucking hate those Ukrainians. I don't know why I was typing. I fucking hate those Ukrainians. Signed, Stalin, XOXO.
Yeah.
Okay, like... Great. Stalin's shitty. Like, I was already on that line anyway. You know, I don't even know how really that would affect my opinion of collectivization, right? I don't know how forced collectivization was.
Yeah.
I'm sure it was. I don't know the baseline. But I just don't know. I don't know how much that would affect me. It would make me think less of Stalin, 100%, but whoop-de fucking do.
Yeah, and that's where I think dogmatism is especially dangerous, and this lionization of the figures of communism in the history. I mean, like, I love Lenin as much as the next guy, I guess, but like whether he was a good dude or not is kind of beside the point.
Yeah.
And it's dangerous for us to think of figures like this as these sort of either untouchable, completely correct in their action, or completely corrupted opportunists. Like, it doesn't matter. Like you said, like maybe I'll dislike Stalin more, or maybe I'll dislike Trotsky more or whatever after I read something, but like the theory is the theory regardless.
I agree with you. The thing is that, like, ultimately collectivization is something that will happen, right? I guess it's just a matter of the tempo here. You know, what Trotsky advocates for in this book, I cannot necessarily get behind yet.
Yeah.
So what's the alternative, I guess? The Stalinist path? Not necessarily. There is something in between the minimum and maximum program here, I'm sure.
Anyway, so that was Transitional Program by Leon Trotsky.
The Death Agony of Capitalism and the Tasks of the Fourth International. Aaron, is this worth reading?
No. 2 no's in a row.
Yeah, I was feeling kind of bad for that, but I feel pretty confident about the next book we read.
Yeah.
Before we get to that, though, what feedback do you have, listener? What else should we read? Why is Trotsky truly the inheritor of the Soviet Union? I don't know why I was saying it like that. Did we miss anything? Did we get anything right?
Probably not.
We're idiots. No. You can send us a message. You can send us an email. You can send us a recommendation. You can send us nudes. Don't do that. You can send it to us at leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com.
Also check us out on TikTok.
Where the episodes I have been putting on YouTube slowly.
Next up, we are going to be reading
Left-Wing Communism, an Infantile Disorder.
Yes.
By Lenin.
By Lenin.
By Lenin. Lenin, they called him.
Yeah, so we're going to be reading Left-Wing Communism, an Infantile Disorder by Lenin.
Yeah. We are about to be asked the question of, shall we participate in this bourgeois democracy? I know for a fact that that is what Lenin talks about in here as a reflection. I know that in 1920-something, 3 maybe, they had an international congress, and they had all the communists come in, and the U.S. communists were doing a fuck-up job. They were not doing a great job. They were going underground, they were creating secret organizations, etc. And Lenin said, knock that shit off. You got to get out there among the people, and part of that, perhaps, not confirmed, but perhaps is participation in bourgeois democracy. So,
yes, if you are among the leftists that have been debating for the last 5 months,
shut the fuck up is what I have to say.
Should you vote? For whom should you vote? All of this sort of thing. This is the episode for you.
Yeah, just you wait. It'll be fun.
So until next time,
don't get left unread.
bye.
See ya.